A Christian theologian, Justo Gonzalez, speaks of our religious history as non-innocent history. And I think that that descriptor applies not only to more recent religious history other than biblical, but also for LDS history. These stories call for thought and introspection and a willingness to admit that the actors are not necessarily moral exemplars, which is what many people go to the Bible expecting to find. We cannot honestly impose a nice Christian morality on many of these people. We need to be willing to wrestle with the text. And that word wrestle is going to come up several times in the next 4 or 5 chapters. But at least in the Hebrew, wrestle is also the word for embrace, of arms around arms and legs around legs and heart to heart. And it's almost as if it's in those hard moments of wrestling that we can find grace. So the story begins with Jacob leaving home. We remember last week he, quote, stole the birthright, unquote, although that's very difficult to do. How do you steal from God? If God's going to give him the birthright, we can't move that one way or the other. And in Genesis 28, it uses the word makom. Did I write that one down? No. We've used it before. It means a certain place. And most often when the text says, go to a place which I will show you, which was in the Akedah, or get up and go, Abram, and I will show you the place you're supposed to go, most often it refers to a holy place, perhaps even the temple. And it's a place where you will meet God. And we're going to see Jacob meet God several times. This first one is at nighttime. And interestingly, sometimes when you meet God, it's in very mundane things. All he did was lay down and go to sleep. So he certainly did not know he was in a holy place. He did not expect this experience to come. He had been traveling, left home down in Beersheba, Hebron area, was traveling north, and arrives at Bethel. He lays down a stone, and I know that we think about, boy, a stone would sure not be very comfortable to sleep on. But I have seen some really interesting headrests. They didn't call them pillows. Something like this shape from the ancient world. And the idea is that it holds your head up because your shoulder doesn't have anywhere to go down into. They don't have inner spring coil mattresses. And so getting your head up helps your spine have better alignment. And some of the commentaries will say, well, he didn't have a saddlebag because he was robbed on the way there. And that's not in the text, but it makes his neighbors look bad, so let's say it. And in not having a saddlebag, he takes a rock, an eben, and uses it for a pillow. Now, pillow is this word, marashot. And what that is here's the word rosh, right there. That's for your head. And so this is a thing to put your head on. That's what the Hebrew means, a thing to put your head on. And as he is sleeping, he has a dream. Now, being a dreamer of dreams, like Joseph coming up, is one of the 4 different forms of official, accurate, acceptable prophecy in the Old Testament. And when we get to, say, Samuel and Saul will talk about what the 4 different ways of being an acceptable prophet are. But one of them is to be a dreamer of dreams, which is halom. And that's this word. And in the dream, he sees a ladder. Now, it's not a ladder. It's a stairway. So you can envision a set of stone steps. The modern word for ladder is a very different one, and there was no ancient word just for ladder. So it kind of changes how we see things. And I remember in one of, see if I can find it here, it was kind of funny. I guess it's on a page I didn't keep. But perhaps it was at York, on one of the great cathedrals, they depict the ladder and angels going up and down. And it's a ladder that, I mean, it would extend entirely from the floor all the way to the ceiling, if on this wall, and more narrow than the bricks. So it is an extremely long ladder that is being depicted on that cathedral, but it is actually a set of stairs. It also means to set up or to climb. And in the English, it says, of course, you remember, angel is messenger, malak. So every time that you see the word angel, you can cross out angel as being some semi-divine being, and instead remind yourself, these are messengers from God. They may be translated beings, they may be spirits, they may be resurrected beings after the resurrection of Christ. They may be human beings, a local stake president or something. We don't know, just that they are messengers from God. Did you?
Just that in Jordan, all of the tombs had stairways.
Yes, yes. He's talking about a Petra. And if you look on the outside of the treasury and many other places, it has carved steps like that as a major architectural motif of how the dead, because Petra is where the dead are buried. It's not a city that you live in. This is the Valley of the Crescent Moon from Indiana Jones, if you're wondering about Petra. They're tombs. And this shows how you get to heaven is by climbing stairs. And it says, behold, the Lord stood above it. Well, in the Hebrew, he doesn't stand above the ladder. He's standing next to Jacob, standing right next to him. And it doesn't really know why he's there. But he presents himself to Jacob just as he had to Abraham and Isaac, and offers him the same promise, the same covenant of land. Look north, south, east, and west. We talked about those directions last week. That they will possess the land of Canaan, and that he will have innumerable seed, and that they are expected to bless all the people of the earth. And so it's the same covenant. And then he goes on and says something he didn't say to Isaac, because Isaac never left the promised land. And it isn't even something he said to Abraham, but he assures Jacob of his providential care during the long journey ahead, promising not to go away from or leave Jacob alone until he is safely home again. Now, what we're going to watch Jacob do is move eastward. He goes to the land owned by the sons of the east, the people of the east. That should suggest that what's going to go on is not necessarily holy. And there is a lot of deception that goes on. It is certainly a return to, quite literally, we'll see the word snake, which is the same word as the serpent in the garden. We'll see deception and beguilement and lying and husbands and wives and lots of animals. You can see this story as, in a way, a reenactment of the fall. But it is certainly a step down. No question, this is a step down. So when Jacob awakes in the morning, he says, "How dreadful is this place?" Now, dreadful should probably be translated more like awesome. It is a place full of awe and wonder. And as a result, once you're in the presence of someone who is awesome, there is dread, there is fear. And so almost every time that an angel comes, the first thing the angel said is, "Fear not." And that's the word that Jacob is using here. This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Now, we'll use the term gate to describe how baptism is the gate into the celestial kingdom. But I hope that you can grasp the image that if this is the house of God, there's an exterior wall around the outside that has gates that you're going through. This is very much the image of the New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation, where you have a gate on the north and the east and the south and the west. This is an enclosed city, a fortified city, or certainly the fortified house. And that, of course, is how Solomon is going to build his temple, is with an external wall and gates. If you've been to Jerusalem, perhaps you've come up through that southern gate, up the steps. I remember that our guide told us that when Neil Armstrong visited Jerusalem, and apparently he was interested in biblical things, he said, "I want to stand someplace that we know Jesus would have stood." And he took him to the southern steps, up into the southern gate of the temple. So this idea of having stairs, two gates, and an enclosing wall around the house of God is exactly how the house of God will be built in the future. Is this edited after the building of the house? Or did they see it in vision and understand that that's how the house of God would be built? We really don't know. Now, an enclosed city, I didn't write this on the board, but an enclosed city is the word Zebel. That means a fortified town, a city with a wall around it. If you've been to Europe, perhaps you have walked the walls of Rothenburg ob der Tauber or York or other cities that have been able to keep their walls. So Zebel is the word for an enclosed city. I hope that that helps you to see the meaning of the name Jezebel. This is Ahab's, the king. Ahaz, his non-Israelite wife who worships Baal. Her name means not an enclosed city. And her name becomes eponymous, one of the terms used for Babylon, a city whose gates are open to anybody. And thus, it's the perfect name to show up in the Book of Mormon when Corianton is running after a harlot. Her name is Isabel. Because that's what her name means, is she's available to anyone to come in. She's not an enclosed city. We'll find that reference of talking about God's city as women over and over and over. And part of it is because Bethel, right, house of God, Beth is also the word for daughter. So it's inherent there in that word. Okay, now Jacob has just been promised seed or descendants as numerous as the dust. And so the next thing he does is a bit graphic, if you stop and think about what it is. He takes the stone that he was sleeping on, he sets it upright, it becomes a pillar, a standing stone, matzebah, which is written down over there. And then he takes oil, which in Hebrew is shemen, and pours it on the standing stone. Just like the Washington Monument, in antiquity, these are phallic symbols. And he is showing what the promise is. If we were to somehow try to illustrate Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, that you'll have seed forever, and that continuation of the seeds is what is a part of becoming like God, this is a good image, okay? But we usually don't stop and think about it that way. When you pour oil on something, though, you are also anointing it. That's how you anoint, is with the pouring of oil. And thus it implies the anointed one, the Messiah. And something else we don't really often think about is the name like Zechariah, which is Zachar, and Yah, which is Lord, Jehovah. Zachar means to remember. And so they'll always translate Zacharias' name as Jehovah remembered Zechariah and Elizabeth and gave them a child. But Zachar's original meaning is male. And we will see that used in the story of Rachel and Leah as they first become pregnant. God remembers them. But the name Zechariah can also be translated as Jehovah is male. And it's not going to get translated that way by other theologians because everybody else is of the opinion, theological opinion, that God is without body parts or passions. And so to speak of God having gender and the ability to engender or have seed is not something other monotheists discuss very often. Even though Trinitarians will talk about Jesus as the Son of God, they mean it in a different way than when Mormons talk about Jesus as the Son of God. And the Muslims, at least, they are absolutely opposed to this. Their statement is, there is one God, and that is Allah. He neither begets nor is he begotten. Okay? Just to distinguish, make sure you understand, no body parts or passions. So this is very much a story about the temple being connected with having seed. And that this is where you become sons and daughters of God, that it's his house, he wants his children to come home. We're going to watch that metaphor of coming home and dad welcoming you. The prodigal son story is very much the story of Jacob. Okay. Now, one thing to consider is why this occurred at Bethel and not in Jerusalem, which is just 10 kilometers away. Good question. The city of Bethel will become one of the 2 sites of temples built in the northern kingdom of Israel after the death of Solomon, when the 2 kingdoms separate and you get Israel to the north and Judah to the south, in an attempt to stop his people from paying their tithing and first fruits and giving the money to the priests down in Jerusalem, a different country. Jeroboam built temples at Dan, the farthest north, and Bethel. And so this text, in a way, is validating the choice of this as a holy site for the northern kingdom. And it used to be called, in verse 19, the name of the city at first was called Luz. Luz is the name of the wife of somebody I knew in Germany, but what it means in Hebrew is almond tree. And if you know the scriptures, you know that in Numbers 17, when they're having a debate over who has authority, who has priesthood, right? Oh, you are only giving authority and priesthood to your family, Moses, because you're a Levite. And your brother is Aaron. This is all nepotism, is the charge against Moses. And so God says, okay, have each tribe bring their staff. So this would be a staff from the head of the tribe. And we're going to see Judah's staff with his name on it later in this story. So it's kind of all of a piece, okay? So we've got these staffs with names on them. They're placed in front of the tent of meeting. Now, someone said once, what is the tent of meeting? Tent of meeting is, or the tabernacle of the congregation, depending on how you want to translate it, is the temporary temple that was set up before the actual tabernacle gets built at Mount Sinai. So you need a private place for God and his prophet to meet. It's called the tent of meeting. It's very much like the endowment house, which was a temporary structure used until they got a permanent temple. And so they set up these 12 staffs, in front of that tent. And in the morning, when they came back, one of them, the rod of Aaron from the tribe of Levi, had rooted, branched, borne leaves, borne flowers, and borne fruit, which were almonds. So the almond tree is saying it belongs to the priesthood, right? So again, it's a validation of that spot as being a holy place, and that the people who are there have priesthood. God makes the promise there that he will bring Jacob home. And the word used is shuv. I will return you. I will turn you again toward home. So again, it's very much the moving eastward. Thankfully, Jacob doesn't keep going east. And I don't know if you remember, but last week when we talked about Abraham, and maybe it was the week before, and his third wife, Keturah, all of his sons left home and dwelt in the east. Okay? So the promise is that he will bring him home. Now you get this really strange conversation between Jacob and God. Jacob says, in effect, if you do that, if you clothe me, if you feed me, if you provide for me, if you give me seed, then I will accept you as my God. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't really sound like the way covenants work. It's usually spoken in the other direction, that the person in power, God says, if you keep my commandments, if you do the things that I ask you to do, then I will be your God, and you will be my people. So it's like Jacob has this whole thing backwards. But we noticed last week when Jacob failed to feed Esau, when Esau was hungry, and Jacob wants the birthright. Remember, we talked about how the birthright, the reason for getting the double portion is so that you'll take care of the widows, you'll take care of your aged parents, you'll take care of your the nieces and nephews if your brothers die. You will take care of the strangers who show up and need to be fed. That's why you get twice as much stuff. And just as he's demanding that he get the birthright, Jacob is failing to feed anybody. And the entire covenant relationship, as you read of it over and over again, is based on Elder Bednar's great word, loving kindness, or chesed. And Jacob does not seem to understand the concept of chesed, of taking what you have and feeding and caring for others. This is some of what I'm going to mention here is from a guy named Burton Vysotsky, who is from the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Union Theological Seminary. So he's a Jewish commentator, in a book by Bill Moyers entitled Genesis. It's from a TV series, PBS series. Jacob is attempting to assert control of everything all the time. Now, he's learned this from his mother, Rebecca, who is also asserting control all the time. And yet, this believing that you are in control is stunningly naive. I think anybody over 50 knows you're not in control of anything, right? Things might be going well today, or they might not. And there's not always much you can do about it. He honestly believes he can steal the birthright. What? He has this incredible vision where God tells him, I'll protect you, I'll bring you home safely. And Jacob's response is, well, if you do that, then I'll let you be God. Really? It's as if he doesn't understand what's at stake or even who his partner is. It's God. He doesn't understand that God holds all the cards. And he will give the blessings to who he chooses to. Now, I've heard members of the church talk about how by keeping our covenants, we can bind God. I think, really? You don't know people who've kept their covenants all their life, showed chesed to everybody, been just wonderful moral exemplars, and then they get Alzheimer's and spend 20 years not knowing anybody, and you've lost that person long before they die. I once was a speaker at a fireside, and the second speaker, this was amazing to me, LDS group, okay? The second speaker was there to sell mystical words that once you had obtained that word, it would force God to do your will. Really? My husband and I are sitting there looking at each other saying, what are we doing here? What are these people thinking? And someone in the audience actually raised their hand and said, you know, last year I paid for that session with you to get that word revealed. And I've forgotten what the word was. Do I have to pay the full amount again, or can I get a discount the second time? And what went through my head was, excuse me, you got a word of power which would bind God to do your will, do whatever you wanted, and you forgot what the word was? How gullible are we? Can you bind God? I highly doubt it. And that means when we make covenants and keep our covenants, the blessings will come when God chooses and in his way. And if we haven't learned that from all the named barren women through all the scriptures, when the promise is seed and then they don't have any seed, we not paying attention? It's going to happen when God chooses. He holds all the cards. Okay. Let's see. What I did want to talk about a little is how this moment in time, the ladder to heaven, is interpreted in the three great peoples of the book, the three monotheistic religions, in Judaism, in Christianity, and in Islam. Within Judaism, they have interpreted the different steps as the hardships faced by Jews during exiles. Now, I find that really interesting because it means that they see going up these steps as real hard work. But what's at the top? Heaven. Are they suggesting that it's only through exile, being sent away, that you can arrive at heaven? In a way, that's very true, right? Because we have to leave the spirit world, we have to leave the Holy of Holies, go through childhood, keep going east out into the world we now live in where there is death, in order to be able to come back. So I think that's an interesting one. And they'll talk about different exiles that the Jews have suffered. Within Christianity, we have John chapter 1, verse 51, where Jesus says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, hereafter ye shall see heaven open, and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." And thus, the body of Christ becomes the ladder, or that which connects earth and heaven. He becomes the mediator through whom we approach God. That's very much in our language of prayer, that we pray to the Father through the Son. And from Alma chapter 12, the Father speaks to us through his Son, through the name of his Son. You'll also see, though, the idea that God sends down angels as messengers to his ambassador in a foreign court. In other words, he's sending angels to bring messages from heaven to Jesus, while Jesus is down here in this foreign country that isn't his home. And we'll see numerous times in Jesus' life where there is communication with the divine, and we'll have, say, Moses and Elijah, who come down from heaven with messages for Jesus. Later, And not much later, I don't know if you know the term the church fathers or the patristic period of the church. Pater being the Latin for father, right? Patriarchy. The church fathers are the earliest Christian writers after the New Testament. We're talking people who might have known Peter and Paul. They lived in the same century. This is 1st century AD. We have writings by these people. They include someone like Clement or Jerome. I'm sorry, that's incorrect. The first group are the apostolic fathers who might have known the apostles. That makes sense. Apostolic fathers. That's Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp. They would have known some of the 12. The next group, from 200 down to about 700 AD, is the patristic period, and that's people like Jerome, Augustine, Origen, Gregory of Nazianzus, etc. And the thing that's interesting about going back and reading their writings is that much of what they wrote was before the great church councils got together, like the Council of Nicaea, and decided what's orthodox and what isn't. So you actually see differences of opinion theologically in the early writers. So Irenaeus saw the ladder as how you get to God. Origen says there's 2 ladders that are available. One is the ascetic ladder. Asceticism is kind of the basis for monks and nuns, giving up a sexual life, giving up money, giving up making their own choices, doing what they're told. That's the basis of the monks and nuns' lives. That's one way that you can reach God while you're still on the earth. And the other is increasing in virtue during your mortal life so that your soul climbs towards God. You become more and more like God. Gregory of Nyssa, in the Life of Moses, says that Moses climbed on Jacob's ladder to reach the heavens where he entered the tabernacle made without hands. Meaning he's climbing stairs to enter the temple that God dwells in up in heaven, and that there is a temple in heaven as well as one on earth, and that will be the goal for many of what are called mystics in several different religions, certainly in Judaism, in Christianity, and in Islam. Mystics who desire to see the face of God and to enter his temple will climb the ladder. Joseph Smith is going to use the idea of the 3 degrees of glory as represented in temple architecture, telestial, terrestrial, and celestial as the ladder to heaven. And architects have made that even more definite by putting stairs or ramps between the rooms so that you literally go up. In the Salt Lake Temple, it's like a rising spiral as you go from one room up to the next, up to the next, up to the next, as you spiral upward. In Ezekiel's temple, in chapter 40 and onward, he even tells you how many stairs it is. It's 8 steps here and 7 steps here, and so it's the ladder. In Islam, the Muslim scholars will draw a parallel between Jacob's vision of the ladder and Muhammad's Miraj, which is, this is a story you may not have ever heard about Muhammad, but the story is that he got on the back of a, flying horse named Barak, or lightning, in Mecca, and flew from Mecca to Jerusalem, landing upon the rock that is under the Dome of the Rock now. And then the horse sprung into heaven, and he is carried through the 7 layers of heaven, meeting different biblical prophets on each of those ladders. It's interesting to read it. This is a quotation from a guy named Martin Ling, who I read his work in college. The ladder of the created universe is the ladder which appeared in a dream to Jacob, who saw it stretching from heaven to earth, with angels going up and down. This is also the straight and narrow path. For indeed, the way of religion is none other than the way of creation itself, retraced from its end back to its beginning. So you can see that idea of you come down from heaven, and then you turn around and go back up to heaven. And that's in all 3 of them. Of course, we have the wonderful hymn that we sing at church that I am surprised when people don't realize that they're singing about Jacob's ladder. And that's "Nearer, my God, to thee." Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee. Even though it be a cross that raiseth me, still all my song shall be, nearer, my God, to thee. Though like the wanderer, that's Jacob, the sun gone down, darkness be over me, my rest a stone, yet in my dreams I'll be, nearer, my God, to thee. There let the way appear steps unto heaven, all that thou sendest me in mercy given, angels to beckon me, nearer, my God, to thee. Then with my waking thoughts, bright with thy praise, out of my stony griefs, Bethel I'll raise. Right? So by my woes to be, nearer, my God, to thee. How do our woes carry us nearer to God? Or, if on joyful wing, cleaving the sky, sun, moon, and stars forgot, upward I fly, still all my song shall be, nearer, my God, to thee. I think it's fascinating that this author chose to talk about sun, moon, and stars, which are the symbols we use for telestial, terrestrial, and celestial kingdom. A later verse was added. The original hymn is by Sarah Flowers Adams, written 1841. Edward Henry Bickerseth wrote, "There in my Father's house, safely at rest, there in my Savior's love, perfectly blessed, age after age to be, nearer, my God, to thee." So that's how we sing about this event. In chapter 29, Jacob continues on his travels. And in verse 1, then Jacob went on his journey and came into the land of the people of the east. And now because you've read about moving eastward, that should suggest some things to us. And he looked, and behold, there was a well in the field, and there's a stone over the well. And he lifts up his eyes and sees Rachel coming with her sheep. They have been out feeding their flocks. These are words that we're going to see over and over, particularly in parables or stories about Jesus, and not recognize the connection. So, for example, where are we? Here we are. Sion, which sounds virtually the same as Zion. Zion starts with that same TS. Sion means sheep. So who is Zion? It's God's flock of sheep. To feed the sheep is roeh, which is also the word for shepherd, because the shepherd eats with the sheep. He sits there with the flock. He doesn't eat them, right? The wicked servants are the ones who eat the sheep. This shepherd sits and eats with them. It becomes the name for shepherd, to feed. It is also the Hebrew word for friend, because the people you eat with are your friends. It's how you become friends. And along with the flock of sheep comes one sheep in particular. Her name is Rachel, which means ewe, or female sheep, of God. Rachel. And Jacob approaches her or comes near her. Now, that word is going to be used all through the Old Testament. And it's, I think, one of the phrases that we miss. So, for example, Jacob is going to approach or come near Esau when he crosses the river at the end of the story. When you get to Sinai, God commands the Israelites, come not near your wives. I want you to be holy when you come near me tomorrow. The priests, after they are anointed and clothed, come near God. Moses approaches God. Elijah comes near God. Amos talks about how we come near in order to make an offering, and it goes all the way through to Malachi. To come near means you are returning westward, and you're getting closer and closer to God. And as you make that journey westward, you're entering the temple and making offerings, and you need to be holy, and then you're going to meet him at the veil and speak with him face to face. And so each of these moments where someone comes near is, as it were, a covenant or temple moment. And we should see that in the relationship of Jacob and Rachel. I'm not so sure you're going to see it in the relationship of Jacob with Leah or either of the other two wives. And I say wives because half of the time that the scriptures talk about Bilhah and Zilpah, it uses the term Isha, which is wife. I've never heard anyone in the church refer to either of them as anything but a concubine. And yet scripture, half of the time, just says they're another wife. I'm not sure why we're uncomfortable as Mormons with Jacob having 4 wives. We've had prophets with many more than that, and didn't claim any of them had to be concubines, right? So I think we need to watch our language a little bit. So Jacob came near. He also came near Isaac to receive his blessing. That was used like 8 times. And so we get Rachel meeting Jacob. And we're going to start another story of breaking laws and deception. And I say that because Leviticus 18:18 says men cannot marry sisters. Now, how are we going to read that? Because all through the writings of the prophets, Jehovah, the Lord, is married to 2 sisters, to Judah and Israel, 2 nations. And they are sisters. Don't be like your sister Israel, Judah, Isaiah will say, Jeremiah will say. So we don't know exactly when that law about don't marry 2 sisters came into effect but it certainly is ambiguous in when it's required and when it isn't. In verse 16, Jacob is going to offer himself for hire, to be paid wages. Now, I skipped 14. Laban says to Jacob, "Surely thou art my bone and my flesh." You hear echoes of Eden? Bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, as Adam meets Eve. I think that it's trying to help us see that perhaps this whole episode, and if we were to draw a map, and I don't have room for one, so we'll just take some of that off. We come from Bethel. Well, here's Beersheba and Hebron, way south. Bethel is just north of Jerusalem. And then they go up and cross over one of the rivers and arrive at Haran. Now, we haven't gone all the way east to wherever Ur is, right? Where Abraham was offered by his father. So we're only halfway. So that means if this is the promised land, if this is celestial, we're in a terrestrial place, kind of like the third day of creation and the whole Garden of Eden story. And we're going to meet snakes, and we're going to beguile people, and the language of Eden gets used over and over and over in the story of Jacob. So, in the Garden of Eden story, it is the serpent that beguiles Eve. In this story, Rebekah and Jacob beguile or deceive Isaac. And then Laban and Leah deceive the deceiver. What goes around comes around, Jacob. And Laban will be called Nakash, which is serpent. It gets translated as enchanter or having a vision. It's when he realizes that Jacob and his family have left. He sees that, he perceives that, he, as an enchanter, and that's the same word as serpent. Now, in being for hire, that's a pretty negative idea. There it is, to be hired. Because you should be a son in the house. And if you're someone who is paid, you're not a son. You're not family. There's no relationship between us other than money. And if our relationship is money, then I can cheat you in order for me to keep more money, and you're going to cheat me to get more money. And that's exactly what we see going on between Jacob and Laban, is everybody's trying to get the most out of the other one, which is quite sad. So the first deception, of course, is on the wedding night when, after 7 years of hired labor, Jacob says, okay, it's time for me to get paid. Now, usually at a wedding, the groom pays for his wife. Jacob has worked 7 years for that dowry. And he gets deceived. There's some really interesting midrash going on about how this deception happens. But I think that we miss an important piece when we read that Leah is tender-eyed. I think it's comparing her to Isaac, who is also tender-eyed or blind. And yet it's Jacob who actually can't see that during the wedding night and consummates the marriage with the wrong girl. Now, the Jews will justify this by saying, well, they were twins. We don't know that they were twins, but it makes his mistake easier to swallow. So when Jacob wakes up and finds, what is this that thou hast done? Who's he echoing? Who said that first? God says that to Adam and Eve. What is this? How do you know that you're naked? And then he says it to Cain. So it's again a Garden of Eden phrase, what is this that thou hast done? And Laban, in explaining it, never uses Leah's name. In other words, he objectifies her. My daughter, your wife, she. And that's going to be a big piece of the rest of the story, maybe most of the Bible, that women don't get named, they don't have rights, they are used by men to get what the men want. And that's happening here with Jacob and Laban. Nobody asked if the girls really wanted this. Leah recognizes that the only way she's going to get married is to marry who her dad chooses, so she goes for it. She then has 4 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. And then an interesting phrase that we pass right over is chapter 30, verse 2. Rachel, when she saw that, and as soon as 1 week is over of the marriage, then Jacob gets to marry Rachel as well. Laban says, give her week. So she's given 7 days of priority of being the wife only, and then Rachel becomes his wife. So he then has to work 7 years after getting Rachel. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister. You see Cain and Abel and envy? Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, give me children or I will die. Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel. And he said, am I in God's place? He has withheld a child from you. Watch out for Jacob's anger, because you're going to hear about Jacob's anger at least 4 or 5 times. And he says he loves Rachel, and yet his anger keeps coming out. Was it an appropriate time for him to get mad at her? How might we have expected a guy who's the priest for the family to react when his wife is upset because she's barren? Consolation, perhaps? Sympathy? But not, why are you blaming me? So Jacob's going to get angry with Laban. He's going to get angry with his sons. And that was what was the problem when Cain envied Abel and he got angry. We tend to do things when we get angry we would not do if we were more rational. Now, at this point in time, it's kind of interesting. The Midrash says that the 3 women who were mothers, and of course because Rachel can't bear, she gives Bilhah, her handmaiden, to Jacob, and you get the same terminology that Sarah used as she gave Hagar to Abram, that I may be built up in her. It's build my house through her. And then, since Leah wants to continue to have kids and power, she gives her handmaiden, Zilpah, to Jacob, and each of those handmaiden each have 2 kids. And the Midrash from Genesis Rabbah says, all 3 mothers, Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah, gathered together and said, we have enough sons. Let Rachel now be remembered. I like that Midrash, that the women get together and pray that God will give a child to Rachel. It's not written that way, but it's kind of nice. It's what we would hope that women who have children would pray for those who don't. And so Rachel is remembered. The tradition is that it was on Rosh Hashanah at the beginning of the year, the same date that many other important events go on, but that it was through the merit of the women's prayers, through the merit of Jacob's prayer, through the merit of Rachel's prayer, that God remembers her and gives her a son. And of course, that son is going to be Joseph next week. Rachel is not herself innocent in this story. We will see some negative things about her, but the names that she gives her sons it sees her as a prophetess. And there's an interesting phrase when Jeremiah describes the people of Judah going into captivity, and those would be the descendants of Leah, because her son is Judah. But the other tribe in Judah that we forget about is Benjamin, which is Rachel's son. And so the people called the Jews actually come from both Rachel and Leah. And as they are being taken into captivity at the time of Nephi, right, into Babylon, the scriptures say, describe Rachel weeping for her children as they're taken into captivity. If you were to make a list of important descendants of these 2 women, you might be surprised at who's in what list. Leah is the ancestor of Judah, David, Solomon, Levi, Moses, Aaron, all the priesthood, Hezekiah, Hasmoneans, Jesus. Rachel is the ancestress of Joseph, Benjamin, and thus King Saul, the first king of Israel, Jeroboam, the king over the northern kingdom, Samson, Joshua, Gideon, Esther, and Elijah. So both of them become important women in the history of the scriptures. And it's like they're the 2 sticks. The stick of Joseph, that's Rachel, and the stick of Judah, that's Leah. And this is where that theme begins. Leah has a son who goes out and finds mandrakes. If you've read Harry Potter, you know what the tradition is about mandrakes, that they scream as you pull them out of the earth. That's a very, very ancient tradition. That goes back to almost biblical times. But the idea that mandrakes and it's on here, are in some way an aphrodisiac, either for the woman or for the man. It's not really clear. But right in the middle of the name is Dode, which is beloved or David. So it has to do with how to get love, is the word, to excite passion. And so Leah hires Jacob from Rachel, that he's been living with, for a night by giving her the mandrakes. That's not a very positive image. And has a son, Issachar, which means I paid for him. And then Jacob apparently didn't need to be hired a second time, but they have a son named Zebulon, which means to dwell with, or it talks about Zabad, which is a dowry. I am due this much. So Leah ends up with 6 sons. And then it mentions that she has a daughter named Dinah, which means judged, because din or Dan means to judge. Now, it's important to know that although the scriptures seem to imply that this is the only daughter, that there's 12 sons and 1 daughter, other scriptures, such as Genesis 37:35 or Genesis 46:15, will number the number of sons and daughters of Jacob at, and this is after they're married, at 33. That Leah has 33 descendants, and that there are sons and daughters. The reality is there are probably as many girls born as there were boys, but their stories don't get told. The stories only get told if it's going to affect the men. And that's why we get the story of Dinah. Now, before we get to that story, Jacob has to return home. So he's now going the opposite direction, and here's the River Jordan, Dead Sea, and right here is a river called the Jabbok River. And they get to that Jabbok River and need to cross that river that flows westward. God comes to Laban and tells him to leave. It's time to go. And without telling, I need to go back. God comes to Jacob and tells him to leave. And Laban is also told by God that Jacob has left. Not sure why that happened. But in chapter 30, verse 1, we find this interesting phrase. That's wrong. Sorry. Somewhere it says, Laban says, I have learned, if you can find it.
27.
What was that?
Verse
27.
27.
Laban says, I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for your sake. I have divined, I have nakashed. I have read the entrails of something. I have snaked. So that's where he uses the word serpent. And so now that he has all these wives and kids, Jacob's told, okay, it's time to go. And Jacob tells Laban, I want to go. And Laban says, not yet. You want more, don't you? More than just these wives and these kids. Stay a few more years, and he'll stay 6 more years, and we get the whole story about the sheep. the dark sheep and the streaked and spotted. And geneticists will tell you there's something going on there. But it is probably talking about a very ancient tradition that what a woman or an animal sees at the time that she conceives affects the child. And that's why pregnant women aren't allowed to see anybody who is misformed or deformed in any way, lest it should affect the child. And so by putting up these tree branches in different colors, it's somehow going to change the genetics of the animals. But it does say in verse 33, when shall I come from my hire before thy face? The sheep are stolen from me. And so stealing things is a major theme through here. Now, are you supposed to steal? Jacob accuses Laban of stealing. Laban accuses Jacob of stealing. Rachel really does steal her father's household gods, and then uses the claim that it was that time of the month that she's menstruating as she sits upon the baggage so that no one can look for those. Joseph is stolen away by his brothers. Benjamin is accused of stealing the cup. There's an awful lot of theft going on in this story that began with Jacob stealing the birthright. And so as the time comes to return home, Jacob again has a vision with God. I am the God of Bethel, it says in chapter 31, verse 11. And Jacob says to him, Hineni, here am I. And his wives, when he asks them to leave home, they say, we are considered as strangers in our father's house. He has sold us to you, and he kept all the money. The idea behind a dowry is that the husband is supposed to pay for the wife, but the wife gets the dowry as her financial backup. Laban didn't give his daughters anything. So they head home. And of course, Laban is warned and goes out to meet them. Why have you taken my daughters? We would have given you a big party had you stayed and told us you were leaving. And Jacob knows that's not going to happen. I left because it was the only way I was going to get away from here. And then we find in 32, Jacob going on his way after making an agreement. They set up a pillar between Laban and Jacob saying, we won't cross over into each other's land again. How much do they trust each other? Not as far as they can throw each other, right? So they kiss each other, which you can see in the way that people greet each other in the Middle East. But how sincere is any of it? Then Jacob goes on his way, and again, God's angels meet him. We think of his vision at Bethel and his vision at when he wrestles with the angel at the river, or whoever he's wrestling with. But there's a lot of other visions in between. And he learns that Esau is coming to meet him. Somebody has warned Esau. The Midrash is that Laban told Esau that Jacob's coming, and that detaining Jacob in building the tower is to give Esau time to get there so that Jacob will be killed. That's what Laban is hoping for. That's the Midrash. So Esau is coming with his hundreds of men. And Jacob is worried. So he divides up his stuff, and he sends all the sheep and all the goats ahead. And then he sends Bilhah and Zilpah and their sons. And then he sends Leah and her 6 sons and daughter. And at the very end, after Esau has killed everybody else, he has Rachel and Joseph. How do you suppose the sons of those wives felt, knowing that their dad saw them as cannon fodder? It's okay if you guys die in protecting me. This is the old man, right? He even puts Rachel and Joseph ahead of himself. That's got to be a little horrifying. But something happens that we wouldn't have expected. A, because Jacob is hardly a moral exemplar. God again meets him at the river. And during this night, when he is terrified that Esau is going to kill him, he wants to get that blessing that, again, that God promised he'd bring him home safe. And he wants to be able to get home safe. And so we have wrestling with the angel, and he gets the new name Israel, one who prevails. Sar is prince or princess like Sarah, or to prevail, to lord it over, one who prevails with God. And then in the morning, he gets up and approaches to meet Esau. And for me, this was a real surprise when I read it carefully, because Esau runs to meet him, embraces him, falls upon his neck, kissed him, and wept. That's almost exactly the description of the father welcoming the prodigal son back home. And who is it in the story that's now in the position of the father? It's Esau, who was the one who didn't want the birthright, right? The one who marries the non-members, the one who apparently is the disappointment to Rebekah. And yet, for the 20 years that Jacob has been gone, what has Esau been doing? Taking care of mom and dad. He has, in effect, received the birthright. He's inherited all that Isaac had because Jacob's not around. He's had to care for his parents because Jacob's not around. And when Jacob says, I hope that I have found grace in thy sight. Take these animals as my offering. I love what Esau says. Esau says, I have enough. We have sufficient for our needs. Esau has grown to the point where he knows it's not about how rich you are, how much stuff you have. It may be about people. It may be about relationships. It may be about chesed. And then Jacob has a moment, thankfully. I have seen thy face. This is verse 10 of chapter 33. I have seen thy face as though I had seen the face of God. And he had just named the place where they wrestled, Peniel, or face of God. So, it looks like everything's going to go really well now. But the first thing Jacob says is, as Esau says, come on home. Mom and Dad will be glad to see you, is thanks, but no thanks. And he goes up and settles at Shechem which is about 80, 90 miles away from his parents. You'd think after 20 years he'd go see mom and dad. But he doesn't. And so he moves up. Now, in a way, Jacob and his wives, and all of them, are Syrian refugees, because that's where Haran is in Syria. So that had some resonance for us. And the next thing that we encounter is the story of Dinah in chapter 34. Dinah, the daughter of Leah, went out to see the daughters of the land. And the rabbis will say, that's where she made her mistake. She left the house. Women aren't allowed to leave the house. And that is still true today. ISIS will tell the women, don't leave the house. Taliban will say to the women, don't leave the house. If you leave the house, you might get attacked by some man who, in seeing you, will be driven beyond what he's able to bear. And be careful what you're wearing. And don't go there, because you shouldn't be there, even if you're with friends. Can you see this language is still the language we use today? And it's the burden of safety is put upon the women as the ones who have to restrict their motions, restrict what they're wearing, restrict where they go and what they do for fear of affecting men in a negative way. So Dinah goes out with the daughters of the land, and when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the whole country, this is the son of the man who rules the entire land in the north. When he saw her, he took her and lay with her and defiled her. Now that defiled is a difficult word in Hebrew. It's inah. And when Sarah was angry with Hagar, she inah'd her. When Joseph is sold into slavery, he is beaten or inah'd. It's often translated as afflicted, but it is not the Hebrew word for rape. The problem we have in this story is that other than the choice she makes to go out with the daughters of the land, we never hear anything from Dinah. No one asks her opinion. No one asked her what happened. Most of us are not aware that she's still living at Shechem's house when her brothers and dad are making arrangements for her marriage to Shechem. Shechem loves her. He wants her. He goes to Jacob and his sons and says, I want to marry your daughter. And they say, well, in our religion, you have to be circumcised in order to marry one of our women. So Shechem gets everybody in town to agree to get circumcised so that he can marry Dinah. He's a convincing guy. And the deal was that we will then be like family, and we will marry your daughters and you can marry ours. This is the discussion with her brothers. And then on the third day, and remember, Dinah is still living with Shechem and his family, because do you remember when we talked about what creates a marriage? Intercourse creates a marriage. And so everyone in the community understands that they're married, and that now Shechem is paying the dowry, and everything's going to be just great. And on the third day, when the men are the most sore, in come Simeon and Levi and kill Shechem and his dad and his brothers and every single male in the entire city. They then steal everything they can carry out of the houses and out of the fields and out of the barns. They take all the animals, and they take the children and the women as slaves. And they will use the women as concubines. Now, who has any honor in this whole story? Only Shechem. And he's not given a voice, as Dinah was not given a voice. And what these men do is literally what we saw going on to the Syrian refugees, to the Yazidi people. ISIS would come into their towns, kill every single man and boy, and keep the women as sex slaves. And this is the 12 tribes of Israel. The whole issue has nothing to do with Dinah. It has to do with how the men perceive their own honor based on what the women in their family are doing. And that Dinah would choose to marry someone that they had not approved was just more than they could deal with. The word deception is only used of the Israelites. The problem in this story is the double standard everywhere. Right? And it continues to be a double standard down to our day, where successful scholars or athletes, if they are accused of rape, the court will say, or the lawyer will say, oh, don't ruin his life. Give him a light sentence, a couple of years maybe. And yet, that woman will live with that experience the rest of her life. Estimates in the United States are that 1 in 5 women in the US will be sexually assaulted or raped in her lifetime. And sadly, our statistics within the church are not much better. It is a culture of men objectifying women, and it is often very subtle in saying what women are allowed to do or where they can go in order that men will act appropriately. And we're at a time where that is starting to change, but it hasn't changed yet. And this objectification of women is a great problem even within the church. Statistics say that 70 women a day in the United States commit suicide because they were attacked. We need to be, and sadly, Utah is about, what did I find, about 30th in the list of sexual assaults. So we're way above the national average. It should not be. Perhaps we can find a way to take the story of Shechem and say, be like Shechem. and teach people to have honor and virtue in themselves, not based on what someone else does or wears. That truly is, I think, what the Lord expects from us, is that each one of us, as we make covenants, as we're on that covenant path, set of stairs that we're crawling up to get back to heaven, we're each on our own, very much on that path, and blaming others for our failures, or trying to lie to God, trying to deceive God. Neither of those are going to get you to heaven. These are really tough stories, but I think that there are messages for us in them. Sadness for Jacob, because Rachel dies before they arrive at Shechem. She dies giving birth to Benjamin. He never sees his mother again because Rebekah has died. He does get down to visit Isaac before Isaac dies. And that must have been an interesting time with Jacob and Esau together burying their dad. I hope that when we have tensions in our families, disagreements, somebody deceiving someone else over birthright or inheritance or the will or whatever is going on, that we can be like Esau and say, take what you need. I have enough. Welcome home. And show chesed to one another. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.